Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is the Auspicious Elections podcast. Today is Sunday, July 30th, 2017, starting at 4:44 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, and this is the 8th episode of the show. Joining me today is Leisa Schaim. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
All right, and we're going to talk today about the auspicious elections for August of 2017. We're wrapping up July now. We're putting this episode out a little bit late, as we usually do, because there's a lot of charts to look at this month. And instead of just focusing on 4 auspicious elections, I think we decided to include at least, 6 or 7 different possible charts, right, Lisa?
We do. We have 6 dates and then one extra time on one of the dates, so 7 charts total.
Okay, awesome. So people get some bonus charts this month. It's not necessarily a great month for elections in terms of like ideal electional charts or standout ones that you would go out of your way to really pick at this point, right? They're more like functional. These charts will kind of work if you really need to start something this month type charts.
Yeah, this month was much more like that. It was, I didn't love the charts. It was so if you had like a longer time span, you might, for a really big project, you might not be choosing a chart this month. But that said, you do have some charts to work with in terms of doing things that you still need to do this month.
Okay, excellent. So we've got a chart for just about every week. And in terms of preliminary stuff, before we get into the charts, I'm trying to think if there's anything like lessons we learned from elections this month or how things went in retrospect. I did notice actually, I noticed at least 2, if not 3 different astrologers launching new websites a couple of days ago at the time of the Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Libra and around the same time of the day, so that they must have been using Sagittarius rising as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if those people, one of them at least potentially might have been using our electional chart, although the other might have sort of come to the conclusion that that was the best election independently.
Right.
But that was our highlighted chart for this month, wasn't it, for July?
Yeah, it was. So it's interesting to see when people are doing things like that. I'm like, oh, did you notice that too? Or wondering if people are going out of their way to use the charts that we've selected.
Yeah, sometimes when it's, a really good electional chart, you'll see a flurry of astrologers using it. And sometimes that's just completely independent because there's certain core rules that just about every electional astrologer knows. And once you know those rules, oftentimes that can lead different astrologers to all, pick the same chart and focus on the same things, especially when it comes to something as straightforward as a auspicious looking and not afflicted Moon-Jupiter conjunction in the same sign.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I remember sometime like last year, there were a number of people who launched things in the middle of the night one night, and someone pointed that out. Like, I see you all.
Right. And supposedly in the 1980s, that was one of the things that before the story broke that tipped off a bunch of the astrologers that Ronald Reagan was probably using an astrologer, is that sometimes he would launch things at weird hours or at weird times. And when the astrologers looked at the charts, they would notice that they were really good electional charts, or at least you could see that somebody seemed to be doing something in order to put certain planets on the angles or make the moon applying to certain planets or things like that. So it's kind of interesting that sometimes once you know electional astrology, you can see other astrologers using it, even if sometimes it's not like readily apparent or they're not advertising that to the public.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
All right. So I think that's it. So let's get into the charts for this month. So the first one
We,
actually,
we might mention just something about the rising signs this month. One nice thing about this month, even though the charts were otherwise a little bit of a mixed bag, is that Mars is in Leo now, so it's not squaring Jupiter anymore.
okay,
So,
so that had been a problem for the past couple of months with Mars in Cancer, was it
mhm.
was in a superior or overcoming square with Jupiter in Libra.
Yeah, and so now, even though we were still using some Libra rising charts before this month, despite that, we can definitely say that Libra rising is kind of less. It's uniformly a good rising sign now. It ends up being Libra rising and Cancer rising because of Venus moving into Cancer, and it's there for most of the month, and so you get both the benefics and the cardinal signs. So Cancer rising and Libra rising are really good this month, as well as Sagittarius rising to some extent, ruled by Jupiter.
Okay, so just as a general rule of thumb this month, if people want to focus either on the electional charts that we're going to highlight, but even on some charts perhaps that we're not going to highlight, they might be most well served by focusing on those two rising signs.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, well, so the first chart that you picked out for this month, let me go ahead and share it for those on the screen, for those that are watching the video version of this. And, probably at this point, even though we're going to continue to make this available as an audio podcast, it really is probably the ideal format to look at this as a video podcast at this point, just because then you can see the charts that we're talking about on the screen as we're sharing them.
Right.
So here's the first chart for this month. It's set for August 2nd, 2017, starting at around 11:40 in the morning, and that's using local time. So wherever you're located, you should be able to set the chart for August 2nd around 11:40 in the morning, and it should approximately give about the same rising sign. And what you want to do is adjust the chart in your location for whatever city you're in until it matches the exact degree of the rising degree that we have in this chart, which is 17 degrees of Libra rising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this one is 17 Libra rising with Jupiter right on the ascendant. And then the ascendant ruler is Venus in Cancer in the 10th house. So you've got both benefics in angular houses, Venus and Jupiter. And in the most prominent angular houses, the 1st and the 10th, Venus is applying to Jupiter, although very widely still at the beginning of the month. And then, and that is with reception, since Venus is ruling Jupiter in Libra. And then we've got Moon in Sagittarius in the 3rd house, and it's applying via sextile to Jupiter with reception. And let's see, the Moon phase is waxing, which is nice. I guess a couple of the drawbacks on this one is that the Moon is still fairly closely square Neptune, although it is separating by about a degree. And then my main drawback with this chart is that Uranus is stationary at this point. It's just about stopped. I think the exact station is later that night or early in the morning for some time zones the next morning. So even though it's not the main focal point of this chart, you will, if you use this for something, be kind of cementing that Uranian stationed energy into it.
Right. So Uranus is getting ready to station, or it's 11 hours from stationing in this chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, there are actually some really nice things in this chart. The Moon phase, the Moon applying to Jupiter with reception, the ascendant ruler applying to Jupiter. I mean, there's some really nice things in this chart, so I wouldn't just, throw it out based on like Uranus being stationary, but it is something to be aware of.
Okay. And let's see, so it's a day chart with Jupiter conjunct the ascendant, so the most positive planet in the chart is conjunct the ascendant. Mercury is also, of course, getting ready to station this month, only about 10 days after this, so we're already in a Mercury shadow and preparing for a Mercury retrograde, which is basically just something you can't get around for August because Mercury is going to be retrograde or preparing to turn retrograde for most of the month, basically, but it's otherwise not a very prominent player in this chart.
Right. Yeah, it's just ruling the 12th and the 9th. But yeah, it's not the focus of the chart.
Okay. And so it's in the 12th. It's in Virgo. It's not stationed yet, but it's very close. If you wanted to, you could adjust the chart a little bit in order to make the midheaven more closely sextile to Mercury within 3 degrees. If you wanted to sort of help Mercury out or mitigate it a little bit from its 12th house position. You could also, if you wanted to put more emphasis on Venus as the ruler of the ascendant, you could put the degree of the midheaven conjunct Venus in the 10th whole sign house in order to give it a little bit extra power, a little bit extra oomph. Let's see. The moon is applying to Jupiter, as you said, with reception, which is incredibly strong. It's also applying to a conjunction with Saturn in the 3rd house, but since it's a day chart, there's a major mitigating factor because Saturn is of the sect favor, so it's not going to be as malefic or as difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But that still could is a little bit more of a sober moon than it might otherwise be in Sagittarius, with Saturn sitting there with it.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting with this chart too, in terms of the topics that might be more highlighted. I mean, you already have the ascendant ruler Venus in the 10th house. So usually, people would think career with the ascendant ruler placed there. But it's also interesting. I was thinking about this the other day with any of the Libra rising charts right now. With Jupiter in the first, you're automatically getting the ruler of the sixth in the first, as well as the ruler of the third house in the first. So it's kind of interesting, even though Neptune is in the sixth, that kind of highlights work matters a little further with Venus in the first and Jupiter ruling the sixth in the first.
In the Venus ruling the sixth in the first, could you say that again?
No,
You mean Jupiter ruling?
Jupiter ruling, yeah. So Venus in the 10th, the ascendant ruler is Venus in the 10th, so it's career matter focal.
Right.
And then Jupiter ruling the sixth in the first. I was just saying that automatically kind of puts a little bit more focus there. So when you have a focus with the sixth and the 10th, it might be a good one for work matters.
Yeah, definitely. And then the drawback for this chart, or the area where there are some problems, is the 11th house, especially with Mars being placed in the 11th. So potential strife in terms of friends or alliances or groups as the sort of potential downfall or sort of drawback to this chart.
Yeah, and depending on one's location, it might be possible to use Sagittarius rising on the same day if the moon is still applying to Jupiter where you are. I was thinking that in particular, if you wanted to make the 11th house better, if you were trying to do something where the 11th house really mattered, because then you would have Jupiter in the 11th instead of Mars in the 11th. But that is a little dependent on location.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even in this chart, there's some mitigation with the 11th house stuff, because the ruler of the 11th house is the sun, which is in its own domicile, and it's actually applying to that sextile with Jupiter in Libra within just, 6 or 7 degrees.
Right.
So the sun is actually technically separating from Mars, which is what's creating the problems in the 11th house sphere, and it's applying to a sextile with Jupiter. And in fact, the moon is transferring the light between the two. So if this was like a horary, then the moon would be separating from the trine with the sun and then applying to the sextile with Jupiter, I believe.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, even if you can't get the Sagittarius rising and the 11th house matters, this, would still be acceptable. Right.
All right. Well, that's a really great sort of chart to start out the month with, especially like you said, for career or for work matters. And then with the ruler of the 10th and the 3rd, even potentially for 3rd house type work or career matters. I almost want to say involving communication and things like that, since it's the 3rd house, although Mercury is, as we said, not terribly strong. So I'm not sure if this is a chart that we would primarily want to emphasize for the purpose of communication.
Yeah, maybe not primarily, but it's still kind of helped out, kind of like the 11th house was, since, the 10th house ruler is in the 3rd, and also Jupiter is ruling the 3rd and the 1st. So it's got good things going on anyway. Right.
All right. Awesome. So that is our first election for the month right out of the gate on this coming Wednesday, so August 2nd. Let's take a look at the second chart that you found for the month, which takes place on August 9th, 2017 at around 10:30 in the morning.
So that one has about 9 degrees of Libra rising. And once again, the ascendant ruler is Venus in Cancer in the 10th house. It's getting a little bit closer than the week before in terms of its application to Jupiter, which is nice. Now it's only about 8 degrees applying. Instead of more widely with the previous chart. The moon is in Pisces in the 6th house, applying closely to a trine with Venus. And again, that's with reception because Venus is in Cancer and the moon is ruling Venus. So that's nice. The moon in the 6th house isn't the best place to put the moon in a cadent house, but it is mitigated in this chart. We put the midheaven at about 10 degrees of Cancer, And that puts Venus on the midheaven as well as the moon trine the midheaven degree. And so that helps it out a little bit of its cadent position. Let's see, what else? The moon is a little bit close to Neptune. That's kind of unavoidable at this point. That's about 3 degrees applying. But you've got the moon Venus trine first. Let's see, what else? Any things that you noted?
No, I mean, it's just nice that even though the moon is in the sixth, that it's applying not just to, it doesn't just have that trine to Venus, but it also has that trine to the degree of the midheaven. And to whatever extent that can be retained, probably people should try to put the degree of the midheaven right about that range, around 9 degrees of Cancer or so that the moon is within 3 degrees and trine to the degree of the midheaven, because otherwise we might avoid a chart where the moon is in the 6th house, except in instances where you can get it closely trine or closely sextile to a planet that's either in an angular house or to the actual degrees of one of those angles, the midheaven or the IC. And not only that, but those placements also help out Mercury, which is also sextile to the MC and to Venus within 3 degrees. So it's actually helping out Mercury as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And that Sun-Jupiter sextile is now still applying and very close now. In this chart, it's only about 1 degree away.
Great. So there's nice. Even though the 11th house is still the area where there's probably going to be the most problems, it's still even more positive in terms of mitigations to that, with the ruler at least applying to Jupiter. And typically the rule is that the condition of placements in the house indicate the first part of the matter. So Mars is causing problems in the 11th house, but because the ruler is applying to benefic, it could be the potential for a positive outcome still in terms of the ultimate outcome, or in terms of the affairs associated with that topic as they'll turn out later on.
Right. Yeah. So it's nice that it does have some mitigation. This is also interesting chart because you have the 10th house, 6th house thing going on again, kind of like the last chart, but just in a different way. So the ascendant ruler is still in the 10th as before. Jupiter is still ruling the 6th in the 1st as before. But this time you have the 10th house ruler in the 6th and then ruled by Jupiter. It's a little bit of a feedback loop going on with the 10th house and the 6th house significations.
Right. And in this one, I mean, one of the issues, the moon is a little bit more challenging of a position. This chart's very similar to the last one in terms of that, just because the moon is with Neptune conjoining it, and then eventually will apply to a superior square with Saturn. So there's a sort of repeat of like Neptune and Saturn themes in terms of the condition and the position of the moon here in this chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
All right. And this chart is also closer to the Mercury retrograde, so it's only 3.4 days away. You can see that in the table that I have in the bottom right of these charts, where on the far right it shows the next station and how far away you are from that. So it shows Mercury as being 3.4 days away from stationing, so it's pretty much already stationary at that point, that means. And Saturn is about 15 days away from stationing, which we'll see later in the month.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, just about 0.5 degree Mercury is from its stationary point.
Okay. All right. So that is right at the beginning of the second weekend of August, or second week of August, on August 9th. Mm-hmm. So then the next chart that we find is just a few days after that one. And this is one of the ones where it has a major drawback that we otherwise might avoid, but I thought it would be okay to include this one that you found just as a potential example of some things that you would pay attention to in an electional chart, and to give people the option if they want to experiment with this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this one is about 19 degrees of Cancer rising, and Venus is close to the degree of the ascendant, and it is a night chart, so Venus is the better benefic, right on the ascendant there, which is nice. The moon is ruling the ascendant, and it's exalted in Taurus in the 11th house. And so it's got several great things going for it already. With the Venus in a night chart right on the ascendant is always a good factor. The moon, so an exalted planet ruling the ascendant is always a good factor. And then the ascendant ruler being in the 11th house is a good house for the ascendant ruler to be. So automatically, those are great things. Unfortunately, the moon, if you look at what it's applying to next, it's squaring Mars first, Mars in Leo in the 2nd house, before it applies to its sextile with Venus in the 1st house. The Moon-Venus sextile would be with mutual reception, but unfortunately it does square Mars first before that, just slightly before that. So that's a bit of a mixed bag. It's a night chart, so Mars isn't as bad as it could be, but Moon applying to Mars still isn't the best aspect you want to go for in an election. So it's tough because this chart has some really nice things, like extra, like compared to most charts, they're nicer than usual, but then it has the Moon-Mars square.
Right. And it is a night chart, so Mars is not as malefic as it would be. And typically the malefic that is of the sect in favor like that, so Mars in a night chart or Saturn in a day chart, the keyword that I've found that comes up over and over again that's the most useful for that situation is that it signifies surmountable difficulties in the native's life. So it's the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or something comes up and it's difficult at first, but eventually you overcome it and you become stronger in the long run as a result of that. That's the type of situation that we would see from this type of Mars, from an applying square, superior square, where the moon as the ruler of the ascendant comes to a superior square with Mars, where the moon is earlier in zodiacal order and therefore in the superior position, and then it hits the malefic that's of the sect in favor before immediately after that forming and completing that very nice sextile with Venus, which is the benefic that's of the sect in favor, which it's in a mutual reception in, and which is also angular. So you can actually make a case that this is one where, even though normally you might want to avoid, that's one of our first rules, is avoid having the ruler of the ascendant applying to a hard aspect with the malefic. This might be one of those instances where you could still justify it because of the strength of the rest of the chart, but you'd have to go into whatever you're starting sort of knowing and understanding and being okay with the potential to run into some surmountable difficulties, which would get in your way before finding eventual success.
Right. Yeah, I think that is one of the things with this type of chart is kind of not deciding whether it's overall completely good or bad, and rather just knowing ahead of time kind of what to expect. Something I do really like in this chart is 4th house significations, because I didn't mention earlier, but Jupiter, of course, is in Libra in the 4th house, and then Venus in the 1st house is ruling the 4th house, and it's applying now by only about 3 degrees to Jupiter. So and then, I mean, usually I don't prioritize this too much, but it turns out that the lot of fortune is also in the 4th house with Jupiter, with Venus in an overcoming square. So I do like those parts of the chart.
Right. And Venus and the lot of fortune itself is ruled by Venus, which is in the 10th sign relative to the lot of fortune, which is like being in the 10th house, which in the webinar that I just did a few days ago with my students of my course on Hellenistic astrology, we read through some passages in Valens where he just repeatedly focused on examples of nativities where the ruler of the lot of fortune in the 10th house from fortune acted as an eminence indicator, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about in the context of an electional chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This chart, of course, you'll use it for lots of other things, but it makes me think of like buying a house, but like haggling over the price or something. It has that kind of energy to it where, the 4th house is really nice, but the 2nd house is where the moon is squaring Mars. Mars is in the 2nd. So, yeah, I mean, I felt really mixed about this chart because there's such lovely things going on, but you just will still get the moon-Mars square.
Yeah, I think the underlying thing, though, is that that's not a complete deal breaker in this chart because of the major mitigations involved.
Right.
which are the fact that it's a night chart, the fact that the moon is the one in the superior position rather than Mars, and the fact that the moon immediately after hitting Mars will hit Venus, the most positive planet in the chart, and it's so close afterwards that it's almost simultaneous. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
you're applying to, you're going to get the less malefic of the two malefics getting activated, but then also the most positive planet in the chart getting activated by that sextile. And when you sort of do the math on that, it still sort of weighs out in favor of doing it and it being more positive rather than more negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so despite it being like 3:30 in the morning, or wherever, time it is in your time zone, I do hope that some people will try this chart out for something and let us know what happens. Because it would be interesting to hear like real life, sort of after stories about this one.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Well, that sounds good. That looks like a good chart then to take into account and to use, especially if people are looking for a chart for that time frame and they don't know what else to go with. It would certainly be better than what a lot of your other options are that day. Like, for example, if you did Leo rising and you made it a day chart, then you would have Mars in the first house in a day chart, which is a big no-no. What else? If you did Virgo rising, you would have Mercury, which is just stationed retrograde as the ruler of the ascendant, and it's very closely opposed by Neptune, which is not great. I mean, you could go through all the rising signs like that, and ultimately what you would come back to is this is the best sort of option if you really needed something on that day.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the 14th, and then the next chart is just a couple of days later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, August 16th. This one is a Libra rising chart. It's about 9 degrees of Libra rising. Venus in the 10th house in Cancer. And this is just about the time of the month where we get to the exact Venus-Jupiter square. It's been applying all month until this point. And so Venus is almost there. It's almost to 19 degrees Cancer, applying to square Jupiter there in the first house. And in this chart, the moon is in Gemini in the 9th house, and it's applying by trine to Jupiter in the first. The major drawback, I would say, in this chart is that Mercury is ruling the moon, and Mercury is retrograde now at this point, and it's in the 12th house. Now, if you can put Mercury sextile the degree of the midheaven to mitigate the 12th house position a little bit. But yeah, otherwise, and again, there's a lot of kind of mixed charts this month rather than extremely good or extremely bad. So I would say this is another mixed one because on the one hand, you get Venus, Jupiter very closely in aspect and applying, and in the angular houses, the first house and the 10th house. So that's great. It's mostly the ruler of the moon that I was a little concerned about.
Right. And I mean, the other thing is that the moon is applying to an opposition with Saturn, so that you get some of that opposition with Saturn in addition to the trine with Jupiter, so that it's a little bit of a mixed bag like the other one was, although the fact that it hits Jupiter first is extremely positive and is much more positive than the fact that it hits an opposition with Saturn later, especially since it's a day chart and Saturn is of the second favor.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it's one of those issues where there's sort of a debate sometimes in the astrological tradition about, do you get one or the other, or do you get both? And sometimes the answer can be that you get both, although in this instance, because the direct application is to Jupiter, and because Jupiter is the more extremely positive planet and the more powerful planet in this instance, that's going to win out, but you're still going to have some obstacles and some difficulties as a result of the opposition with Saturn.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that just happens a lot at this point if you put the moon in any of the mutable signs, is that you get Saturn along with that right now.
Right. Got it. Okay. And Saturn is actually, what is it? It's about 8 days, it's about a week away from stationing at this point. So now, like Uranus earlier in the month, Saturn is getting to that point where it's starting to get kind of amped up or kind of powered up as well.
Yeah, it's a busy month in terms of 2 eclipses and, early in the first week and then the third week. And then you've got Mercury stationing retrograde earlier and Saturn stationing retrograde later. So there's a lot of things going on.
Right. All right. So let's move on to the next chart, which takes place a couple days later.
Mm-hmm. So this was the featured chart of the month on the podcast, and this is a Cancer rising chart. It's about 20, 21 degrees Cancer rising. I put Venus right on the ascendant in a night chart, so the most positive planet in the chart right on the ascendant degree. The moon is in Cancer as well, and so the ascendant ruler is the moon in its own sign, which is very positive. And Jupiter is still in Libra in the 4th house. And so you have the moon, which is also the ascendant ruler, applying to a square with Jupiter, and then also to a conjunction with Venus. Now, of course, it's still about 9-10 degrees off from both of those. And so it will hit some other planets first. It's just barely separating from a sextile with that Mercury in the 3rd right now. At the time of this election, it will trine Neptune after that. It will oppose Pluto, and then it will hit Venus and Jupiter. So that was kind of unavoidable just with the times possible. But this seemed like the cleanest chart in some ways this month, even though it is a balsamic moon. As you can see, the sun is in Leo. And so that not only makes it balsamic because it's right before a new moon in Leo, but that new moon is actually then the solar eclipse as well. So it's very close to the eclipse and it's balsamic. So those are kind of two dings against it. But on the other hand, it doesn't have any of these sort of like squares to malefics, or it's a little bit cleaner in the sense of just the moon being in the same sign as the benefic of the sect and ruling the ascendant. So some of those factors seemed nice to me.
Yeah. I mean, it is really emphasizing that Venus placement in Cancer even more, or I don't know, a lot in terms of, or compared to some of the other charts this month, especially with the moon there. It is getting pretty close to that eclipse, but it's still a little bit, far enough away that if you're looking for a chart for this time frame, this is the best that you're going to find. And it probably would be really good for Venus related things and first house related things, especially in terms of aesthetics or beauty or physical appearance or something like that, where you need to launch something where the aesthetic sort of appeal of what you're doing is paramount. This would be a really good chart for that, I think, because of the prominence of Venus in the night chart.
Mm-hmm, right. And then that Venus is ruling the 11th. So that would make the 11th house matters kind of better, although it is starting to get a little bit close now to the square with Uranus. It's applying to Uranus in about 8 degrees. So yeah, that's going on as well. Venus then is ruling the 4th. So it brings 4th house matters to the forefront. So any of those topics should be pretty positive this month.
All right. That looks pretty good. I mean, it's a pretty good chart. It's up there. It also depends on whether you're trying to start something new or whether you're trying to bring to completion a project or a series of projects that need to be sort of wrapped up. And that might be what this is more useful for, in terms of the fact that the moon is so late in its cycle and it's, waning and getting so close to completing its cycle. It might be a good thing for closing something down or doing something that already has some maturity and has been going for a while, rather than something that is sort of brand new and is just sort of coming out for the first time. This might be sort of better for bringing something to completion or putting an end to something that was initiated previously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be.
All right. Well, that looks pretty good. And I'm trying to think of anything else that needs to be mentioned about this chart, but I think that might be it.
I think the only other thing I would say about this one is, again, it's getting even a little bit closer now to that Saturn station, and especially since this is a night chart, with Saturn being the more difficult malefic at night, it is in the 6th house. So 6th house matters probably would not be a good thing to use this chart for.
Sure. So like subordinates or health matters or illness to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or yeah, I mean, work-related things. I don't think this would be the best chart for.
Okay, got it. All right. And so that's the 18th. And then we jump forward more than a week in order to get the last couple of charts on the same day, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, August 25th is the last date we have, but a couple possible rising signs. So this was the Cancer rising chart. So at 2:56, looks like in the morning, that was about 21 degrees of Cancer rising. And that has Venus still in the first house. It's in its last degree of Cancer, but is still in the first for now. The moon is ruling the ascendant, and it's in Libra in the fourth house, and it's applying to a conjunction with Jupiter, which is really positive. Always nice if you can to get Moon Jupiter applying charts, and especially Moon applying to conjoin Jupiter charts is really positive. And let's see what else was going on in this chart. I think that was the main thing. Saturn is stationary in this chart, so this is around the exact station at this point. It's still a night chart, so again, sixth house matters. Not really something to do to use this for. And you know, with the moon applying to Jupiter, it would be nicer if you could get a day chart, and that's why we provided two possible rising signs depending on your location, if it's possible. But before we do that, anything that you wanted to note about the Cancer rising chart?
No, just that this chart, you know, unlike some of the other charts earlier this month where we were doing Libra rising and it was all about Venus in the 10th house, this one is a little bit more private, and this one's more focused on the fourth house and things like one's home and foundations and family and things of that sort of nature, or things that have to do with privacy or secrecy, is one of the big traditional associations with the fourth house, because it's actually the most hidden part of the chart, where it's under the earth pretty much as far as you can go. So, you know, matters that you'd prefer to keep private, or things that are sensitive or personal, or things that have to do with your home and your living situation and your general sense of your foundations, I think are probably the strongest things that this chart could be used for, and that it's very much directed towards with those fourth house placements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the only other thing I would note maybe is that I'm sure someone's going to point this out, that the Venus-Uranus square is very close at this point. It is, however, separating, even though it's still pretty close in degree. It's not even quite a degree separating.
Right. The Venus-Uranus square is close, and the moon is also closely square Pluto, although at least in this location, at the time that we have it, it's separating, although some people further east than us in Denver would potentially still have it applying. So there would be a question there of whether that matters to you and whether that's a deal breaker, or whether, again, if it's just potential surmountable difficulties that you'd be willing to accept in order to get a relatively decent chart.
Right. And if that was an issue, you could potentially look at this last chart with the other rising sign to see if that would work better for some people in their locations.
Okay, so let's pull this up now. So the final chart is later the same day on August 25th, 2017 at about 8:55 a.m. In the morning with early Libra rising.
Yeah, and so this one is much closer to the exact Moon-Jupiter conjunction, and it's a day chart, and so it makes that much more positive, because then you have the moon applying to Jupiter is the moon applying to the benefic of the sect, so it's the most positive planet in the chart, which then also puts that most positive planet in the first house. So that's really great. I think initially I was thinking that some people probably won't be able to get this one because it's so closely applying that it may be past the conjunction in some places, but in some other places this will still be applying. And so if you can get it, the moon will definitely be past its square with Pluto, and now just almost right there with Jupiter.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, pretty much anywhere east of Denver, they'll still be able to get the Moon Jupiter conjunction, but anywhere west, like if you're on the western coast of the United States, then it might already be separating by that point. Although that, still not necessarily a deal breaker, because you'd still have a close conjunction with the moon and Jupiter, and the moon would eventually be applying to a square with Venus. Although it would also eventually hit an opposition with Uranus as well. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there.
Mm-hmm, right. And this particular chart has the midheaven at about 2.5 degrees of Cancer, sextile the sun, just in case you want to kind of mitigate the sun, which is the sectolite at this point during the day is in the 12th house. And so that would kind of pull it out of its kind of obscurity a little bit.
Right, definitely. And Mercury as well. And then, of course, this chart makes that Venus-Uranus square, which is separating at this point, but it's still relatively close, much more prominent because it makes Venus the ruler of the ascendant. And that is potentially destabilizing, especially coming from other people or destabilizations that originate in the 7th house with other people's, such as partners or relationships. But it is at least separating, so that may be something in the past which may not necessarily represent an event coming up in the future that will be problematic, but instead something more about the foundation of what is initiated that could have some instability or some sort of surprises kind of built into it. But nonetheless, if you're looking for a chart this late in the month, this is probably something that you'd have to accept or be able to work with, which would be like a reasonable exchange to make in terms of trying to find an auspicious chart at this point in August.
Right, and that's a good reminder of those issues in general, in trying to find charts where you're trying to do something kind of moderately important, maybe not the most important thing you're going to do all year, but it's still even when people might point out some of these attributes and be like, oh no, I don't want a Venus-Uranus square in the chart or things like that, it still ends up being more positive than if you go through all of the rest of the rising signs, or the days in between some of these charts. They're not nearly as positive.
Right. And sort of one last thing we sort of skipped is this, of course, is the month of the eclipse, or I guess the 2 eclipses, as it were. So that's why that's part of the reason why there was this long break in between the last chart and the final set of charts, is what happened in between was the eclipse in Leo.
Yeah, on the 21st, right?
Yeah. And there's kind of a debate about that in terms of some texts, and there's some traditions of astrology that really avoid against doing anything during eclipses or doing elections on eclipses, under the premise that that can be a negative omen or something that's destabilizing or will sort of cast a shadow over what you're doing. And that's kind of a tricky thing because there's this dual treatment of eclipses in the astrological tradition, where on the one hand, they're sometimes viewed as negative omens that can indicate negative things like famine or plagues or the death of kings or things like that. But on the other hand, they can also be important markers in time that signify new developments that are significant turning points. And in that way, it doesn't necessarily have to be bad or good, but it can kind of go either way in terms of it being a significant turning point.
Right. Yeah, I think we discussed that at some point earlier with some previous eclipses. And yeah, it is always a major turning point for everyone somewhere in their chart, so it can just indicate that. For this month, we didn't quite test it in terms of having any actual elections on the eclipse days themselves on August 7th and 21st, but it just kind of happened that way rather than specifically avoiding it, I guess. These are, maybe for some people who might want to avoid them, they're still kind of close, just a few days.
Right. I mean, well, because part of the problem in testing this one is we can't get a clean test because it's not exactly like a happy eclipse because it's taking place so close to Mars right there in the later parts of Leo by the time the eclipse takes place. And then eventually right after it, Mercury goes retrograde in Virgo and retrogrades back into Leo and conjoins Mars around the eclipse degree around 28 Leo. So there's all this like crazy Mars activity going on in Leo at the same time, which potentially for some people is going to push the scales a little bit in more of the direction of it being kind of a difficult type eclipse rather than an easier or more positive one. There's a little bit of mitigation from that sextile with Jupiter, but that's not necessarily quite enough to completely remove the fact that Mars is so prominent or playing such a prominent role in this eclipse.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely not the one to test at least that rule about eclipse elections, for sure.
Right, especially in a day chart, although maybe you could try it in a night chart. And there's actually a separate question that came up during the forecast episode this month, which is kind of interesting, which is, will it be dark enough during the total eclipse, especially if you're right in the path of it, that you'll be able to see the stars? And if so, will you be able to actually see Mars? Because Mars might be far enough away from the sun that if the sun is suddenly eclipsed and goes dark out, you might actually be able to see Mars as a little twinkling star that's kind of hanging out pretty close there, which is kind of a cool idea. And I think somebody linked to an astronomy article that said that that might actually be possible. So I'll be interested in checking that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, anything? We forgot to say too that then in this chart, Saturn is exactly stationed in the third. That is another factor.
Right. So Saturn's stationing in the third, and it's super, super close to the Mercury Sun Cazimi, which will happen when that exact conjunction takes place. So there's like some interesting and weird type sort of communication type indications happening at this time as well. Not necessarily great, but maybe not necessarily a huge deal breaker either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I'd say overall, this month is kind of a number of charts that have mixed factors involved. And, I think that this has only happened once in a while, but I do always love to hear. I know that some people out there are using some of these charts for elections and to start things. And so please do let us know, because I'm always really curious to hear how these actually work out in practice. I don't always use them, all of them myself for things. So definitely write in and let us know.
Definitely. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode then. So you're available for electional consultations if anybody wants to get a chart from you that's actually personalized to a specific event, or that, is far enough in the future that it's not something we're covering in the next month of electional charts, basically, right?
Right. Yeah. So leisaschaim.com. I do elections and natal consultations and so forth.
Okay. And I, of course, have my online course on electional astrology, where I have a series of lectures that go through all of the basic steps that we use when we're finding these electional charts. And you can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. I think I also have like a $10 or $15 lecture on just a Cliff Notes version of like 10 tips for electional astrology and choosing auspicious electional charts. And I think you can find that in the store of my consulting website, which is at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks a lot to everybody who's a patron and who's following this work. So this is a show that we do each month for patrons of the Astrology Podcast who support the show on the $5 or $10 tiers. Thank you if this is your first month watching us. I hope you like the program. We're always trying to expand and improve it and add new things and sort of tweak other things. So if there's anything you'd like to see us do in the future, please let us know. And thanks again for supporting our work.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, I think that's it for today then. So I'll just switch that over. So thanks everyone for watching this month's episode, and we'll see you again at the end of August.